Hello everybody, this is il1keturtles here doing another video for headsupsitandgo.com. Today I shall be doing my first concept video, and the concept will be check raising the river. So I'm just starting off with a bit of a slideshow here, and then I shall move on with some examples. So first, to start with value check raising. Generally, the times when we want to be check raising for value is when our opponent will bet any hand he will call a bet with, as well as bet some additional bluffs. And in those cases, check raising the river with value hands will be better than leading. We also want it to be when our perceived leading range is strong, because he's unlikely to pay off with weak hands if our leading range seems strong, and also when our checking range seems weak, because then he's more likely to bet thin or to bluff, and those generally work hand in hand. When we're check raising as a bluff, we typically want it to be when villain checks the turn and bets the river, because he's often bluffing or has like a weak thin value hand, which leaves him susceptible to be check raised on the river, because he'd generally bet most of his stronger hands on the turn, and also he'd bet a lot of his draws on the turn, which means if the draw completes on the river and he makes a bet, he's not as likely to have it. But that's very opponent dependent, and generally we need to be able to rep a hand. So now I'm going to move on to some examples. Okay, so in this first hand, I flat king 10 in the big blind, flop checks through, and the turn comes a king. So I like to check here, and the reason I like to check is if he has turned king X, he will bet it anyway, and also it's a pretty good hand. It's a pretty good card for him to try and rep if he checked air. And I think that even fish can recognize the king as a pretty reasonable hand to attempt at least a small bluff on. So I like to check, and he bets. So here, basically, I decide to check call the turn and check raise the river, because it allows him to continue with his bluffs, and he's going to bet king X on most, if not all, rivers anyway. So I check call, the river comes a 5, he bets, and then I put my check raise in. And as far as sizing goes, it's a bit over 3x. I think it's a pretty good size. He folds. So on this second hand, I flat Jack 9 suited in the big blind at a bit less than 20 big blinds, or perhaps a bit more than 20 big blinds, a little bit more. I check call this flop, and the turn comes an ace. Check on the turn, the river comes a flush card. So this is kind of the spot where our perceived range for leading the river is very strong, and our perceived range for checking the river is very weak, because most people when they lead here will have flushes, king X, ace X, and maybe some other 2 pairs and stuff like king 6. And mostly when people check the river, they mostly have something weak like 4x, 2x trying to get to showdown, or like 6-5 or something like that. So I check. I don't think that he's going to really pay off much worse if I lead the river. So I check, he bets, I jam, and he folds. So in this hand I flat 10-8 to a min raise at a bit over 40 big blinds. I check call this flop. I think that check raising the flop would be pretty reasonable, but also same for the Jack 9 hand. But we're basically not going to concentrate too much on flop spots. We're mostly talking about turn play and how that affects our river check raising ranges. So I check call the flop. The turn goes check check, and on the river we complete the nut straight with a couple of other straights out there, a 4 and an 8. So basically, I think that again we should probably be checking. Our perceived range for leading is quite strong. We can have a bunch of 4x, 8x and even 10-8. We can also have some sets or some two-pair hands that are betting thin. So I think that again, it's a good spot for the check, and it's also a spot where we're going to check with a lot of weak one pair or shitty two pair hands. So this is also sort of good from a perspective of protecting our ranges, although that's not really what we're focusing on here. So I check, he bets, and I should also mention that he's going to bet all of his 8x, 4x, and he'll probably bet some two pairs. If he makes something like 6-5, 7-6 on the river, pretty sure he's going to bet that, although he probably wouldn't bet that as 180. So I basically just elected to check shove here, hoping that he had a straight, and just called it off because of the bet sizing. I think he's kind of nuts or air in this spot. Well, not nuts or air necessarily, but like he's got a big hand or air. I think that two pair would bet thinner. And also, I don't think two pair is going to call any size check raise. So, obviously his 8x is inelastic. His 4x is, it's probably inelastic as well. Like, I don't think that, if he has like 4x, I don't think he calls 460 and folds versus a shove. So I think that basically his range is inelastic. So I do think check shoving the river here is the best play. So here I flat with 9-7 pre, pretty standard. Check call with my middle pair. So here again the turn goes check check, and the river brings the flush. So this hand I'm basically always going to check. No value in leading, obviously. But here I elected to actually turn my hand into a bluff. Now I think that this is pretty cool, because if he has top pair or better, he's going to continue on the turn, I assume. I should also mention that this player is a regular. So, because of that, I also expect him to bet a lot of his flush draws on the turn. Maybe even all of them. But, well, I guess it kind of depends if he has showdown value. Like, if he has 4x of diamonds, he might check the turn. But yeah, basically all of his flush combos on the turn, flush draw combos on the turn. So I check raise the river. I can have a lot of flushes here when I check call the flop, and the turn goes check check. And I would check raise them on the river because again, leading the river is just not really going to get that much value. My perceived range is pretty strong. The only hands that I've really missed with are hands like 8-9 and Jack 8 type stuff. But compared to the ace x 10x flushes, all that stuff that I can have, as well as 5-6 stuff like 7-4 suited, 10-4 suited, all that stuff, my value range is much wider, and I have very few bluffs. So I check again and check raise, and unfortunately here he calls me off with ace queen. However, I do think that his call there with ace queen is probably correct. When he checks the turn and hits that hand on the river and bets it and faces a check raise, it's pretty much the best hand in his range, except for some like ace 7, ace 4, ace 3 stuff, and ace king. So he's very close to the top of his range there. So he should be calling the check raise with that hand, I think. I flat a min raise with ace 3 suited. Flop comes queen 9-3. Would have been check calling, but flop checks through. When the turn also checks through, I think this guy probably just has air a lot in this spot. Some 3x, some turned 8x, possibly some ace highs, king highs, that sort of stuff. So on the 3 river, my options between leading and checking, obviously. I think that ace high, I'm sort of undecided on whether ace high is likely to call our river lead. On one hand, we probably would have bet with 9x and queen x on the turn, but on the other hand, we also would have bet a lot of our bluffs on the turn, especially the ones that have equity, which on this board, queen 9-8 is like a lot of our hands that we flatten the big blind. And also, it's kind of queer to just lead the river with a bluff after just checking down to the river, when villain is perceived to have a lot of showdown value himself. So I elected to check. I think that the 3 is a reasonable card for him to try and rep. I think that this spot here is sort of contingent on ace high. Like if he calls ace high, I think we should probably just lead the river. Or if he is like quite likely to bluff randomly here, which I don't think many people are, then we should be more likely to check. But I think overall it's probably pretty close between checking and leading. So I check, he bets, I check raise, and he calls with 9-7, which I think that he probably should have bet with on the turn. I like his flop check though. I think his flop check's good on that board texture. Here I flat a min raise with ace 10. Check on the flop. Turn comes a 2. I think here it's probably just going to be a good spot to check down. I'm going to have a lot of other hands in my range that I'm going to be better off leading with. Hands with less showdown value, but more equity. So I think checking here is going to be good. The main reason I put this hand in is mostly to illustrate that I think it's very important that we check this river. He's going to bet all of his ace-x, and he's also probably going to try and rep this card a lot. Now, I did check raise. Not a huge fan. I guess that it's only really ace. I guess, he could have ace 4, ace 2, ace king, ace jack. And I just think that this is a bit too thin. Yeah. I mostly just wanted to show this hand just to say that I think it's important that we check on the ace river.